Hey there, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment that lets us dig into something that maybe doesn't quite make it into the actual sermon, something related to a text here at from a message here at Sunny Slope that we just didn't get the time to fully really expand upon. We are spending the month of January looking at the story of Jonah, which is a story in the Old Testament. One of the questions that a lot of times people have about the story of Jonah is, did it really happen? Now, before we just dismiss that question out of hand, we should at least take it seriously. We should at least consider why a person might ask that question. And I think the answer, in some ways, the answer is not that hard to understand. The idea of a person being swallowed up by a fish and then being spit out and living to tell about it is in some ways that's it can be understandable why a person might say, well, it's a little hard to believe. And so then what typically the next move is to say, well, it might not have literally happened, but meant to be a story, or it's a myth that has a good lesson for us to learn. Um, Now, I think, how do we respond to that? What would you say to that? Like if someone says, look, you can't really actually believe that because it's just a great story, but nobody could possibly have survived it. You might simply say, well, the Bible says it, so it must be true. And of course, on one level, that's actually a fair response. I think we have to, it is in the Bible, and so we have to actually, believe it. But the question is, how do we interpret it? And I want to make a couple of observations. The first, obviously, there's since we can't prove that it happened, that there actually was any sort of fish. But I would say this: those who are arguing against this being an actual story, the burden of proof is upon them. In other words, um, the burden of proof is on the person who wants to maintain that this is actually a legend or a myth rather than a historical event. And there's a couple of problems that begin to come up then. And one of them is that this story is not really written in the same form as a myth or a legend would have typically been written. Normally, if you were there were tons of legends and tons of myths that have circulated, but they don't tie themselves to any historical facts or details. The book of Jonah begins with a very specific person, and a very real, actual human being who actually lived. It doesn't just say, there was once a great warrior, or there was once a cowardly prophet or something along those lines. It actually says the word of the Lord came to a man named Jonah, who was the son of Amittai, to go down to Nineveh and to preach the gospel, or to preach against it. And so that is not how myths or legends were typically told. You wouldn't actually include historical details. And so the burden, the balance of the evidence in that sense lays on this being an actual historical event. There's another thing that you know, I think is worth pointing out, and this is a little less, in my mind anyways, it's a little less clear, but the question is, well, could this have happened, right? So people who want to dismiss this story as a myth or as a legend would say, well, this could never happen. But maybe we should pause before we come to that conclusion. How do we know it could never happen? The fact is, um, there is some evidence that something similar to this actually did happen about 150 years ago to a 21-year-old sailor. I forget his name. I think his name was, I think his first, I want to say his first name was William, but it happened near the Falkland Islands. And there was a whaling vessel out, and they were sailing along, and then all of a sudden this guy fell overboard, and he was swallowed up by this massive whale. And the next morning the crew was able to get the whale, and they killed it. They thought the man was dead. They were pretty certain he was lost. But when they cut it open to, whatever, process it, lo and behold, the guy was in there, and he was in rough shape, and he was unconscious, but he actually survived. He was in the whale for about 36 hours. Now, the reason I hesitate with that is because there is some question about the historicity of that story. There's a little bit of debate. And so if it never actually happened, then obviously this is a moot point. But there is some evidence that it did happen, that this really actually did take place. And so that would lead us then to the conclusion that at least it could happen, even if it's not a common occurrence. It's possible. There is a possibility. And maybe the better scientific leg to stand on is to acknowledge that um, there are whales that are large enough to swallow a small house. I mean, there's some giant whales and some giant sea creatures that are big enough that certainly they'd have no trouble, swallowing a human being whole. And not that it would be pleasant, not that it'd be very life-threatening actually, but at least it's plausible. There's no reason to say it's actually a scientific impossibility. It might be an implausible thing, but doesn't mean it's impossible. And that brings me maybe to the last point that I want to make. The people who argue against the historicity of Jonah are usually arguing from a vantage point that kind of comes at it with an a priori conclusion that supernatural events like this don't happen. So they start from now they might not quite say it like this, but they start from the assumption that supernatural things like this are impossible. And so when they come to a story in the Bible like this, they say, well, that couldn't happen. And you say, well, why not? And they would say, well, because things like that don't happen. And you say, well, but in if you allow for the fact that there is a God who intervenes in human events and human activities and he does the supernatural, then it is plausible. And they say, well, no, that can't be because we don't believe in God. And you say, well, why don't you believe in God? Well, because that's supernatural. And it becomes kind of a circular logic, a problem of circular logic. And so I would say my response would be, if we believe and if we accept a worldview that allows for the supernatural, then we have to allow for the possibility that the story of Jonah is indeed a historical event. And so that, I mean, that's my conclusion, that indeed this is a historical event, that it's not something that's happening every day. It's not the normal course of nature, but that's the point. This is God stepping in to do an extraordinary act as a way of making a point. So is it historical? Well, yes, I believe it is. I mean, I know and I understand there are arguments against that, but I think the balance of the evidence here weighs on this being a historical event and not just a myth or a legend. Thanks for watching this episode of The Cutting Room Floor. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on The Cutting Room Floor.